Hi guys.
Ready to go. Okay.
Now we're good.
Hi, I'm Tessa Whitehead, and this is Cydne Jasmin Coleby. Today we'll be having our first virtual artist-on-artist talk to discuss the breadth and depth of Cydne's process in creating her works for this exhibition, To Scatter the Seeds. Hello.
Hi.
So let's just jump right in. What did you initially conceptualize for material usage when thinking of the title of the exhibition? And it's a two-part question. Did this materialize, or did you have to go with something else?
So when thinking of the materials for the exhibition, like my art materials, they don't really change. I traditionally just continue to use the same combination of either like decorative papers, paint, sand, crepe paper, glitters, tricks that you would find like in Junkanoo Festival here.
Yeah.
So those things didn't really change, but when it comes to my source materials, they change throughout the practice, and especially depending on what I'm dealing with. So when it came into this project, I was thinking a lot about plants, plant terminology, like ecology, like literally, and ecosystems and environment. And I wanted to do a lot of work with understanding what would have been considered native plants here.
Yeah.
So I was looking at bush medicines. I also was curious about like what plants are quote unquote native to the Bahamas. And apparently we don't even use that terminology here. We just use primary and secondary for plants. Because it's like primary is just like what was pre-colonial, and secondary is what exists here and is okay here, but post-colonial.
Okay.
Or like
that
yeah.
suits the environment. That's not invasive.
Boom.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was how they considered that. So you see some in one of the pieces and give them room to grow. The background is in a black coppice environment, which is the landscape that would have been here prior to colonial settlement. So you do see that in the works a bit. And then when it came to imagery, I was curious about like how we existed during colonial times. But I think I should probably backtrack to give that some context.
Yeah.
Because the title of the show, To Scatter Seeds, is the direct translation of diaspora.
Right. Which I learned when we were talking about doing this panel, even though we talk so much and we have such a rich understanding of what diaspora means in the Caribbean. I didn't know that was the direct translation.
Me either. I learned that when I was doing my MFA at Bard last year. I was talking to one of the writing chairs, Jess Arndt, and when I was talking about seeds and how I was having a difficulty with terminologies like native, invasive, and so on and so forth, because I just felt like nativity or looking at something being native as being that it had to be there, as being like, okay, this is the thing for the environment, rather than looking at it as how supportive it is of the environment. I was having difficulty with that.
Right.
And then I was talking about being in diaspora, and we were talking about migration, and then he pointed out that diaspora like literally means to scatter seeds.
Okay. So that was the overarching start of this. You'd already been thinking about it. And then when the exhibition started to take shape, that you had that part of it, and you also were starting to think about the flora and fauna here and how that related to pre, during, and post-colonial entry point.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, Jody and Keisha would tell you like I'm to blame for the title of the show, because this is what I was working through.
Right.
And then we all responded to it really well. So I was thinking about migrations and existing within these different spaces. Like, what does that actually look like? And with this body of work specifically, I was thinking about what it meant to be a good seed. I was like, okay, well, if I personify a seed, like what does that look like? So I landed on children. So when I was thinking about shaping a place and understanding a place, so I had to look at the landscape before we had human intervention. So that's where I was looking at the plant life, but then I started to look at the colonial history because I wouldn't exist here without that. And then I was looking at my personal histories like I normally do within my practice. So I went to the archives and just was scouring different photos to just get an understanding of place and some imagery. And then I was going through my personal archives, so family photos, and seeing like which ones were resonating with this work. And then I was looking up like different sort of symbols. I was reading through different bush medicine books to understand like which plants might have been um, that I was familiar with but didn't really understand
Yeah.
what people might use them for.
In that experience of researching, did you find a lot of it was really illuminating and different than you had an instinct for, or did you find that a lot of your own history and understanding of your space had already informed you of certain, like you'd already resonated with certain aspects of the flora and fauna which showed up in your work, or was it as a result of the research, or both?
I think a little bit of both. I think understanding which plants were native and not native, or quote unquote, well, original as far as we can date. That was an interesting moment because there was like so much of the fruits and vegetables that we eat here. It's just like that's not from here. Like,
and they had begun to feel
that, yeah, begun to feel like they were a part of the landscape. Like that was
culture.
Yeah, our culture, our identity. You know, like pigeon plum is like from here. Sea grapes are from here. But then when you get to things like pineapple, we have a whole pineapple fest in Eleuthera, and it's just like, yeah, we brought that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
At least as far as like they told me at the BNT, the Bahamas National Trust.
Yeah.
That's so I'm just like, oh, that's so interesting. Like bananas also not from here.
Okay. Yeah.
But you know, so these different symbols that we have that speak to tropicality are like implanted or transplanted.
Right.
And then I also thought about how these terminologies relate to who I am, because I feel like a transplant that's firmly cemented here. Bless you. So I thought it was very fascinating how they had that description of primary and secondary versus native, non-native, and well, they still have invasive, but
okay.
Yeah, it's just like, oh yeah, you were here first, and now you're here now. Like, we have like a more integrated way of looking at plants and place and people, and I think that that also speaks to us being here in diaspora.
Yeah. It's already the knowledge and the understanding of that is already sort of integrated into how they're thinking about it. Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In continuing with your investigation of personal and collective or ancestral relationships to trauma and conditioning, how does the titles of your work and the exhibition further push this mission? I don't know if you wanted to just talk about it generally, and then maybe we could, because I know they can change the slides, and you could maybe go into a couple of the pieces just to illuminate those titles.
Yeah, sure. So again, like with this body of work, my main question was what does it mean to be a good seed? So if I'm thinking about diaspora, it's just like, oh, you scattered a seed, and a seed being this biomarker of everything that you could possibly be and everything that you were. Like, what does it mean for it to be a good seed? Like, is it just that it grew? Is it just that it created a strong plant? Or is it that the plant had to look like what you expected it to look like? So that was a question that I was curious about, and how does that relate to my existence and our existence as like a collective? So when it came to trauma and conditioning, I was like, how does that play a part into it? Like this idea of I'm conditioning you to be this type of person or this idea of who should be. And like, what does that actually do to the being, the person, the idea that it can't actually be its full self? So that was how I looked at it in some regards. So with the works in the show, as I'm looking at them, I was looking through like different moments in my history, like in my formative years, that would have shaped that and how I might see that with other people. So this one that's behind you is called Forever Young.
Forever Young?
Yeah, Forever Young. And with that one, I was thinking about like youth being a space of just like vitality. but also thinking about my relationship to my family and love being a form of generational wealth that we don't really talk about. So when it came to my practice started a lot from grief, but in that grief, like I'm doing things because of and not in spite of. It's just like, oh, I can pull from a lot of generative experiences and moments that are still supporting me to this day.
Right.
So as like in that, you can never take that from me, and that
Yeah.
helps inform how I'm going to treat other people.
Right.
So with the title of this work, it comes from a song that my dad used to like to sing to me.
Yeah.
Forever Young by Rod Stewart.
Yeah.
And every time I hear the song, I smile, I think of him. And then I found like papers that had like the lyrics on use this. So I'm just like, huh, what happens if you have like this generative space? Like if you prop up a plant, so it's young and it needs support in order to grow.
Right.
Like that helps it become its full self. Like what does that even look like? You know? And if you prop it up correctly, it could hopefully withstand like some natural and unnatural threats. So I was thinking about that in that title. Um, Give them the room to grow. Like I said, that one is the background is taken from the primeval forest.
In this painting,
No,
oh,
this
in
one.
this one. Sorry, give them room to grow. Sorry,
Yeah, and give them room to grow.
into the different painting. That's taken. The background taken from the primeval forest.
Yeah, the primeval.
Which is a part here that has the primary forest.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that one, that's just like I don't know if they have more spaces, but I know for sure in Nassau, like that's the only space of land that is as it essentially is as it would have been prior to any sort of colonial development.
Right.
So you get to see the environment of the Bahamas as like, oh, this is what it would have been when the Lucayans were here or the Arawaks were here.
Right.
And it was just like, oh man, this is like such a calming space. But when thinking about shaping a place and shaping people or this idea of diaspora, like the Caribbean is essentially like a fabrication because like how it exists now is not how it was intended to be without somebody coming in. It's like, I think that this space should look like this. And I think that we should include this and these people should come here. And because it's like a colony.
Yeah.
So it's in the vision of what a colony should be.
Right.
So
it wasn't built up slowly by groups of people. It had a system and then another system was imposed over it.
Yeah.
Brutalized over it. Yeah.
So there's one brutal system, and then like what results from that. Like there are a bunch of different responses that happen in the shaping of where we are today. But being in a space of just like, okay, if none of this ever happened, this is what it could look like. So I thought that that was an apt space for me thinking about what happens if you just give people the space to develop into what they're supposed to be.
Right. So it's like, what if this wasn't, what if our reality had been more nurturing and less violent?
Less
or no violence. Yeah. Less violent, no violence.
No
yeah.
violence. It was less like forced or
People were just allowed to be. Yeah.
So and in that work, like it's the juxtaposition of me in preschool with my classmates and then the background there. So the titles were speaking about for that one, the title's like, oh, what happens if you give people space to grow? And I'm looking at who raised you. And that one is the most direct response to like family, personal lineage influence in this conversation of diaspora and like how do you grow and how do you change?
Yeah.
Because it's this idea of, oh, how does your family influence like who you become? So in that one, you see like a bunch of different little pollinators and stuff in there.
Yeah.
Or just like family influence. Then we have fertile ground, which also speaks to like susceptibility and no, not that one, yay. Fertile ground that speaks to susceptibility and arrangement, or just like how do you make soil and people in space like more malleable and like primed for ideas. And
And then with that piece, you were talking about having almost like an agricultural space usage in it. So I understood it as the way you had kind of blocked it out, had also like had a layer of thinking about that agricultural cutting up of spaces and rows of seeds and rows of plants, which you can really see, especially in the garments.
Yeah. Of making just like these crops, like because it's just like, okay, well, this is actually a very functional way to section off growing things in mass.
Yeah.
And even on a small scale, like my dad used to have like a pretty decent garden in the back of the house.
Yeah.
So it's just like, oh, if you understand to give this one space and then give this one space, then they actually could grow much better.
Yeah.
And then there's also more, what do you call them, like indigenous planting techniques. Like I think they call it like the Three Sisters, where you go like beans, corn, and something else together.
Yeah.
So it's also like understanding like how these different things play next to each other.
Yeah.
So with that one, I was thinking about organizational structures and like how that just makes everything like flow more efficiently, and thinking about efficiency. So
it's one of the layers on the work. So you've got a title, which has one part of the narrative, and then one part of your narrative, which is like layered on top, kind of textured on top, is that thinking about agriculture, kind of woven in. There's lots of different parts of the narrative woven in that make it such a rich image, right? So the image has like lots of different parts of the story woven in.
Yeah.
And we're just talking about those two, but we'll come back to it as well. Yeah.
And then the last one was the unshakable ease in a protected child. So I was thinking about protection in relationship to cultivation of not only place, space, but also people, and how that's so necessary and influential to how one grows. So you see like a homestead in there, like a tree, a lot of watchful peeking eyes in different spaces. So whether it be through the leaves themselves or through the windows.
Yes.
So I was thinking about how I grew up, because I grew up in a very big family, or at least household compound situation. So I grew up with like 11 other people.
Yeah.
And the closest person in age to me was 8 years older. And it was my immediate family. So it would have been my parents, two of my two sisters on my mom's side, and then my mom's siblings and a mom. And my mom was the second to last child. So I was just there with a bunch of older people.
Okay. So you were very cared for.
I felt that was very like looked after.
Yeah.
Cared for, yes, of course. My family really did love me. But like the main thing that I think I took from that was just like, yeah, as somebody here is always like aware of my existence and my safety.
You go straight to the office. And so the way you're talking, seeing that through the work is you can see a singular person, you can see you, and then you're having so many watchful eyes. Also, the house feels very watching because it's looming over, but not in a unsettling way. And then you're seeing that there's eyes coming through parts of the work, so that it's kind of showing like this watching family around you. I wonder if we've answered this question, kind of maybe, but let's just go over it. Symbolism in your personal and collective defining of the terms scatter and seed for this body of work, what were the primary questions recycling in your studio space that informed your creation process? I think we've touched on it, but maybe we could just, I don't know, revisit or like clarify a couple of the questions that were really clear to you.
Well, speaking very specifically on scatter and then seed, I think I did touch on it, but it's just like when you scatter, it's like a separation of a thing, like you're fragmenting something. And there's fragmentation that happens throughout my practice. It's like I'm doing collage, and then the way that I collage figures historically in my practice, like in two works, like you'd see it a lot in the hands, like how I'm fragmenting bodies and then putting them back together. So I'm always thinking about this scattering and rearranging in my practice.
Yes.
And in this work, I was thinking about like, okay, if I separate from the source in some way, like if I'm coming from a tree and now I'm a seed, like how does where I land influence what I become?
Yeah.
And then how much of that is like how much does the environment like, and I think about this throughout my practice all the time, but how much does your environment determine what you already are and could be versus how much do you influence that in return?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that those are the thing when it came to scatter and seeds, those were two
Those were the
thoughts.
kind of pins you were returning to as
Mhm.
other things were coming in.
Yeah. But also there's like some other points because I was thinking about how that came from the term diaspora. It's like, okay, well, what part of my African diasporic like heritage do I see in my everyday and also see like could I see in the work? So in my practice, I am using Junkanoo aesthetics.
Yeah, that's been part of your work from the beginning, like
Hmm.
a Junkanoo aesthetic. But it seems almost like innate to just how you think,
Hmm.
and then almost like you then could make a comparison between the two, which came later. That's from a viewer. It seems like that was a part of just how you view visual,
Hmm.
and maybe just being a part of Junkanoo or being around it had somehow influenced it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard as a Bahamian to not, and especially as a Bahamian creative, to not like look at Junkanoo at least once.
Right.
I'm sure everybody had like some project in school that forced them to do it, or they went to Barabbas in the Tribe for the Junkanoo tour. And for anybody that's tuning in that doesn't know what Junkanoo is, it's a cultural festival here, and it takes place in different countries. Like Jamaica has a version of it, but Bahamian Junkanoo has evolved in a very specific way that's very vibrant and material specific and material dense and heavy. And a lot of the things that I use in my practice are like from that space or inspired by that space. So that was one thing that I was looking at is like how does that show up? And then I have some symbolism, some symbols in the work that are Adinkra symbols.
I was gonna just ask you about that next.
Okay.
It really, I was talking to you about it right before we came on, and I said it's so clear that there's a big underbelly to your work. When you're looking at it visually, there's just so much information, and just how you work and your output is clearly coming as a result of a huge interweaving of knowledge, research, thought processes, and it's kind of showing up differently in different works. And then when you were able to tell me a little bit more about this body, you had talked about Adinkra symbols, and I wondered if you could
Speak to them.
speak to them, because I think it shares a whole other. It helps build a larger, richer narrative in each work, clearly, but also something that, yeah, you can see that there's a richer narrative, and then also it's so interesting to know the language behind it. Yeah.
Yeah. So for anybody who might be tuning in who doesn't know, Dinka symbols, they have their history in, let me see if I could say these people's name. I think
Ivory Coast.
So yeah, there's in the Ivory Coast and also Ghana.
Yep.
And thanks to 23andMe, I know that that's where I'm from essentially. That's where my DNA comes from. But these symbols, they carry different meanings that speak to, I don't want to like principles or stories or understandings. So two of the symbols that I used were one for family, the one for family ties, and then another one for Nyame Patanapa, I think is how I pronounce it. Please forgive me if I mispronounce it, please. But it means God is a good parent. So I was thinking about them in two of the pieces that deal even like the most specifically to family narratives. So I'm looking at this genealogical space of just like, oh, this ancestry that I wouldn't know otherwise if not for technology. It's just like, okay, well, this is where my family comes from. And like, here are some symbols from those spaces. And how does that show up like in my family? Like, how does those and things like intrinsically shape like how we operate?
Right.
Yeah. So the symbols are in who raised you in the background on like what seems like a wicker pattern or almost like a breeze block pattern. Like
Yeah.
that is the anchor symbol for family and family ties. And then on the fence.
Amazing how it's also a symbol that we have another layer with that it's not the same, but it's so similar to the breeze block that, or it has some kind of overlap. I wonder if it's just an innate symbol that's gotten kind of had a thread through that. Yeah.
I do wonder that. I was having a conversation with Matthew Ame
Yeah.
about like breeze block being a space for that. I don't know if I can't confidently say if there's an actual history.
It's just interesting how there's layers of that, and it's like also an important part of our landscape. Yeah.
And yeah, like caveat related but unrelated, like some of the imagery in the family ties work as I'm looking at it, it's just like that lamp is my grandmother's lamp, and then she also had breeze block in her house, which I thought was like really beautiful, and the lamp was in front of the breeze block. So it was just like, oh, this way of repeating these things that I grew up with in childhood, and how do they show up with a different narrative. And then also the symbol that was in an unshakable ease in a protected child, on the orange panel with the yellow symbols, that is the one that means God is a good parent. And I grew up with a lot of like a very like Christian and spiritually like dedicated family. So I always grew up with this idea and a higher being protective over you.
Yeah.
So I just like thinking about my personal family structure, that was just like, oh, this is like an integral part of how protection showed up for me. I'm not necessarily proselytizing and telling people like they have to ascribe to these doctrines, because I know everybody has their own relationship, but this is like,
that was a part of your history.
Yeah, it's a part of history, and like how these spaces could, or this belief in something that could be protective and outside of yourself and bigger than yourself, how that could give you the confidence and the hope necessary to move through spaces that are like of vulnerability and tension, like, so that's why I included that stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we talked about, I mentioned how it's clear there's so much research and so much of a practice just going on underneath and behind and at all times, regardless of the visual output. So I was wondering if you could talk us through the literal and practical practice that you have, just starting like cyclically, like from the moment you're researching, what are some of the go-tos for you for research? I'm sure it changes a lot, but, and then how do you take that into the physical starting of a work, and how does that kind of go all the way through to the exhibition, just practically?
So my research, that's a really good question. My research, it starts oddly enough either through like a physical gesture or excuse me, or like a moment that like triggers like a curiosity, and then from there I either like I go inward and be like, okay, is this a pattern that I might see within myself? Or I'm get like very observational to see if I see this in my everyday, whatever the thing is, that how do I see this moment that I just experienced in other people?
Right.
And then from there I go a little bit deeper to be like, like good old Google or a search engine, and be like, okay, like where does this lead me to? So then I go through rabbit holes that way. Then I read a bunch of books that might be on the thing.
Right. Yep.
And then I look up, that triggers like different investigations, like side quests that all come together. So whether that be like visual investigations, sometimes go into like archives. Also in this work, like I drove around and just took photos in different spaces, like either in my house or in neighborhoods, just to have as references. And maybe I will use in the future. Maybe I won't. Some of them showed up here. Um, so it's just like a physical on the ground investigation.
Yeah.
Like then there's a literary investigation, and then there's a certain experiment that happens when I start actually designing the work. Because that when you're doing collage, like you start to have like different languages that butt up against each other. There's like so much juxtapositions that spark another type of conversation. Um, so yeah, I think with this one, this work, it was like plants were the baseline. So I was doing a lot of research on plants, figuring out what that constituted, reading books on them. I wanted to actually make papers. I did a residency with the Ponciana Paper Press.
Yeah.
So I was learning a lot about like paper making and plant fibers in that space. And in one of the works, give them the room to grow, the hair on the little girl that on me was actually from paper that I made during that residency.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was just like, okay, how do like different plant fibers like show up in art practices? And paper was because I use paper, and that's like an automatic thought. I was like, okay, well, how does that show up there? Then going to like the BNT and finally doing the tour and understanding like what the environment here looked like. Going to the archives and then talking to them. It's just like, okay, well, how were homes set up? How were if you have any images of just like plants, the environment, any sort of agricultural spaces. I think I also looked at hotels too to see like how those shape things as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of your research, because it sounds like you like such an important part of the work.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it you end up showing up in other work, and then some of it gets kept because it's like you're probably just seeing so much about what's relative to your practice, and then you're sort of scooping a parts of it away.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm doing like a curation with like the source material that I have.
Right.
And some of it is just like, okay, I understand the conversation that I want to have, but it's not like ready for like a public conversation just yet.
Yeah.
So those sorts of decisions get made because it's just like, I don't want to throw something out too quick before it's like ready for like, oh, I didn't think this through enough. Maybe that's just like anxiety, or maybe that's me being responsible, or a combination of the two. But I like to I'm building like throughout my practice, whether it be like what people would automatically associate with me as like my visual language. But I feel like I'm building up a lexicon and I'm trying to understand like what this glossary looks like.
100. That's so, from what you're talking about, it makes so much sense that it's so many different elements, visual elements and research elements that are coming together to put together a story. Yeah, and you're probably building up such a visual language getting to each piece that can be repurposed or rethought of throughout your practice.
Yeah, because it's just like, okay, well, these things, I create like certain associations with them. But I also understand that that's another thing about how you read in general. It's just like, oh, because I might look at something and see a sour sop, somebody else might not see that same thing. And I'm very curious about how things get translated and mistranslated based off of personal experience and then specificity of where the work is being showed. So I like these moments of just like, oh, you don't understand my dialect or you don't understand my accent, even though we're speaking.
Which you're probably having a lot of. That's probably another layer right now, specifically because you're studying. You're doing a master's degree in New York, so you're probably on top of everything else, experiencing what this work looks like to a non-Bahamian or non-Caribbean person. So you're getting that information, which when you were studying at UB, you wouldn't have that same gap.
Yeah.
Which is more information for you, more interest in more information.
Yeah, I mean, that was why I wanted to do a master's because I like my work and I think it's strong. But I was just concerned. It's just like, okay, well, I've been thinking and showing and building in the same environment. Like maybe there's something that I might be blindsided to.
Right.
and maybe there's a way that this is being received and perceived that I want to be aware of, like how to actually play into that.
Right.
So that, yeah, that is something that I navigate when I'm off to school, and I welcome it. I don't think it's too bad. I'm trying to be good about not throwing my accent too much. It's like the thing I want to hold on to a little bit. um, but yeah, it's just interesting because sometimes people will come into my space for one-on-ones, or like how the crits are set up, because I'm doing my master's at art. How the crits were set up last year, most of them, well, my crits were blind. And
Right.
that was an interesting thing to see, like people coming in and just giving me blind reads on what they saw the work as and how it existed and what their interpretations of how it could change and grow.
That is interesting
Yeah.
because with this work, you are getting so much information blind because you're spending time thinking visually about how spaces come together. And of course, there's a person in there, so that gives you some information about what it could be about. And then you're getting the material usage, so you're understanding maybe how the material informs a place. And as you're talking about Junkanoo, like how it could relate to that. But then when you're talking about how much research is going into each thing, the language and the research, knowing of each part of the collage is so illuminating. So it's probably interesting to get both reads.
Yeah. No, it really is like to just see how people are seeing things, because like when you're so deep in the thick of making work, like you think everything's like really obvious.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just need to realize that it's not.
Yeah. It's good. It's good information. So we talked about how much research goes into each piece, and you were able to say how even in some of the pieces, like just part of the collage was a whole process to make, and how that the process to make it was also a kind of rich part of the research into this final narrative that feeds into your ideas about your practice and you and things we've talked about. And then at that point, you're taking all these different pieces and you're drawing them and kind of collecting them and putting them together into different visual fields, into different canvases. And then the last part is the kind of not painting, but the applying.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Like by the time I get to making the work, it's like for the most part so figured out that I'm in autopilot. And funnily enough, I listen to a lot of audiobooks, so I'm probably listening to something for something else.
Right.
For another project.
So the research is so important. It's like research, and then little bits of output that are an exploration of the depth of the research. Yeah. Which makes each body of work exciting because it's a building on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like to see like how they build on top of each other. So I try to like put them, I'm most happy like right before the work gets collected and I get to see them all like in a tight space, and I can like communicate with them and they communicate back to me. And then I get to see like how that informs something else.
Yeah.
Because I know that the works have their own like vibrancy, like literally because the color palette is vibrant, but like they have their own energy and vibrancy as what they are.
Yeah. So funny when you're talking about the work in encyclopedia, I keep thinking of Tavares's encyclopedia. I don't remember the name right now, but the encyclopedia, because of it being this thing that he then pulls from. But then thinking about your work has such a feminine aspect to it because it's like the keeper of a full story, which I think is kind of innately feminine, even though males are storytellers. I think like the keeper of the fullness of a story, possibly because you're a generator.
Yeah.
It comes from a feminine point of view. So it has some similarity, which maybe is something to do with creating a new story or like pulling out a story which hasn't been told correctly. And then also bringing in your feminine everything, like all the research, all the collectivity and everything. I'm wondering if I'm allowed to ask one more.
That was funny that you said that, because I had a conversation that I've been thinking a lot about my practice and like the things that I've quote unquote collected. And it's just like, at what point do I shift from being like the god of my collection to the custodian of it?
Right.
And I think I always want to live.
One more question? Okay. Sorry.
I always want to live like in a custodial space, because I think when people get power, especially in the space of just like ownership, it's just like, oh, I get to just like do whatever I want, and nothing's like necessarily wrong with that. But if I like to think of myself more as like a conduit of whatever I'm talking about and whatever I'm talking through, and hopefully that might work.
Perspective.
Yeah. And hopefully my work could be a conduit for other people to enter in sort of a conversation or a headspace that could be fruitful or generative for them. But I don't necessarily want to just be like, here is it, and just like I made this thing, it's mine. It's just like, well, no, like I'm more of like I'm just a caretaker for these ideas.
Right.
And hopefully when I pass them on, somebody else will take care of them too.
I think it's so important to hear you say that as another female artist, because I think a lot of the times when you're asked, what do you want people to get out of the work, or what, and I think there's a lot of excitement about like new things or groundbreaking things, and like, this is going to change this thing. And I think I've always wondered if there was another way to talk about it, of just like a custodian of a thing, and whether that had as much value, which I think it does. 100%. And so it's interesting, so like very affirming to hear you talk about your work as a custodian of a really important thing, or a collection in your case, a huge collection of all kinds of different important parts of your research, of your personal research, which plays into different parts of a larger history. You're just bringing them together and like holding them, and then allowing people to see it in one's place is very important.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, one more question, but I wonder if hands off.
No, let's go.
You talk about the visual tools. So I think we've talked about this actually. I think I'm so fascinated by the fact that you've taken so many different aspects of research. So I have here colonial archives, Adinkra symbols, Junkanoo aesthetics, native flora and fauna, and family anecdotes, which seems to be an overarching thing for your work generally, that those are access points for you to pull from and research in depth to start to create one work or a body of work. And well, I had asked here actually what was the starting point, but you've answered it, because you said that you had just a spark and you will just have a kind of thought, and then you take that innate thought or that interest, and then you like place all this research, or you kind of finger out all this research.
Yeah. Like in different instances, it might be with me looking at a trigger. So that's where like some aspects of like the trauma and conditioning comes from. It's like, oh, I've been triggered into this response, or I've been triggered into this position. Why is that? Of late, it's not always been like negative triggers. It might be like something like more light, maybe not necessarily something joyous, but just light. And it's just like, okay, what has triggered this way of orienting myself? Whether that's like a mental orientation or a physical orientation, like that's another thing that I'm very curious about. Like how do we responsively orient how we see ourselves in space?
Right.
So with these
do feel very hopeful.
Yeah.
These works.
Yeah, I try to.
You're talking about love and care.
I feel like it would be wrong for me to make work with children that's not like, you need something in 2025. Yeah. We definitely needed it, but it's just like, because it's a space, like me being, even if you're looking at these different things that I'm pulling from, like if I'm a seed, like these are the different biomarkers that came with me,
right?
And I'm just pulling from the things that I just intrinsically who I am and what I could be. So if I'm thinking about like making a good seed and cultivating it, it's just like, oh, this is such a space of possibility. I don't think I could have made dreary work with this, even if some of the underlying stories that led me to them would have been would have been harder to reconcile, or if I talked about them in a different way, they could have had like a very different, like harsh conversation. But in this space, it's just like, no, I wasn't what this work was about.
Right.
And I had a good time making all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we were gonna have time for questions.
Yeah.
So I think it's, I don't know. That's where they were going.
Oh,
Oh no, I don't think we have any.
oh, we don't have any
Let me
questions?
just ask.
Maybe no.
Do we have any?
Oh,
10 more minutes. Are there any questions? Oh, sorry. Oh, no.
no questions.
Okay.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
had a good time talking to you.
Yeah, you too. I think if there's no questions, I think we're ready to wrap up.
Yeah, I think. Unless there's a question from
Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know if I had any more questions. Well, I don't know. Is there anything else that you wanted to know?
I mean, always, but I think I just got myself into a corner because I thought we had questions.
That's fair.
Maybe we can.
Look at that. Okay.
What we do?
Well,
Well, it's your birthday.
it is my birthday.
Anyone watching?
It is my birthday today.
Sorry. Yeah, we're wrapping up.
Thank you, everyone.
Jody's reminding me to thank everybody for watching and coming, and hopefully, I'm guessing this video is also going to be staged, so it'll be hopefully watchable for future. I plan on sharing it. I love to hear more about you.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we get to that.
Do we? Oh.